By the time the third day arrived in the intensive care unit, the atmosphere was thick with both anticipation and sorrow. Messages filled with hope and compassion continued to arrive from every corner of the globe, but the Swaggart family could not ignore the harsh reality presented by the doctors. Inside Jimmy's hospital room, the persistent beeping of medical equipment and the muffled steps of nurses created a steady, sobering background. He still depended on a ventilator for every breath, and though his heartbeat had become a bit more steady, he hadn't woken up. That Wednesday morning, the family gathered in private with the team of doctors watching over Jimmy. The physician in charge, respected for his candor, spared them any illusions. He explained gently but firmly that Jimmy's situation was still extremely serious. He had survived the immediate aftermath of his heart stopping, but the harm done, particularly given his age, was profound. Those first 3 days had been critical, but the hardest part might still lie ahead. The medical staff made it clear that while his heart now beat on its own, they were deeply worried about how long his brain had been deprived of oxygen. Jimmy had yet to regain consciousness, and neurologists were running tests and scans to gauge the extent of the damage. The coming days, they said, would provide crucial insight into his future if recovery was possible at all. For Frances, Jimmy's wife, the news was quietly devastating. She stayed by his side, her hand wrapped around his, absorbing the somber report with grace and silent tears. She had always understood how delicate life was, especially at this stage. But there was a world of difference between understanding fragility and living through it. Despite her heartbreak, she thanked the doctors for their dedication and, as she had every day, voiced her trust in God's plan, leaving the outcome in divine hands. Donnie and Gabrielle, Jimmy's children, were more subdued than usual. They had been alternating nights at the hospital, barely sleeping, spending long hours just outside their father's room, lost in memories. To the world, Jimmy might have been a towering figure, but to them, it was simply Dad, the man who played music after dinner, who prayed for them when they were ill, who never lost hope, even when others did. Later that day, Donnie addressed the congregation at Family Worship Center, sharing the latest update. He didn't attempt to offer false encouragement. Instead, he spoke with a mixture of respect, honesty, and a serene sense of acceptance. He told them his father was still with them, but his body was exhausted. The doctors were doing all they could, and the family was grateful. Donnie's words shifted the focus to a deeper type of faith, one that went beyond hoping for miracles to embracing whatever might come. He paused and said, "We don't know what tomorrow will bring, but we know who is in control of tomorrow." The sanctuary was silent, the gravity of the moment evident in the bowed heads and folded hands. Tears were shed, but there was also a sense of unity in the uncertainty. Jimmy's struggle was ongoing, the outcome still unresolved. Back at the hospital, nurses worked quietly, checking monitors, giving medications, and doing their best to keep Jimmy comfortable. Frances rarely left his bedside. She kept a small speaker playing his favorite hymns, sometimes humming along. The music was a comforting thread connecting their present vigil to happier days. The doctors were careful in their updates, offering no timelines, making no promises, and providing only measured, cautious information. Yet, in that uncertainty, there was a shared understanding among the hospital staff. Jimmy was no ordinary patient. And this was no ordinary situation. Outside the hospital, the prayers continued. People around the world lifted Jimmy's name. In their hearts, not with demands or desperation, but with steady faith. Believing that whether he recovered or was called home, his life had already been a remarkable gift. While machines measured his vital signs, prayers carried his name heavenward. A hushed reverence settled over those who loved him, a silence rooted in trust, surrender, and the awareness that even in life's darkest valleys, they were not alone. As time passed and Jimmy remained unconscious, thoughts turned not just to the man fighting for life, but to the immense legacy he had created. His impact reached far beyond his family: pastors, singers, former addicts, single mothers, prisoners. Young preachers and elderly couples all remembered how his voice had touched their lives. Jimmy's ministry began simply preaching in small Southern churches in the 1950s. He was driven by passion and a deep calling to share the gospel. His sermons were heartfelt, his tears genuine, and his message uncomplicated. Jesus saves. By the 1970s, he was a familiar name across America, sharing his faith through both preaching and soulful music. His songs, like There Is a River, Jesus, Use Me, and Mercy Rewrote My Life, became more than melodies. They became instruments of ministry, bringing comfort and hope to many. In the 1980s, his work expanded into one of the world's largest televangelism networks. Millions tuned in every week to his broadcasts, and his crusades drew massive crowds on several continents. It wasn't just his fame that mattered. It was the revival spirit that moved through television, radio, and recordings, reaching people who might never have set foot in a church. Of course, Jimmy's journey wasn't free of hardship. The world witnessed his very public scandals and personal struggles. Through it all, he never abandoned his faith. He wept, repented, and kept preaching not to justify himself, but to spread the message of grace. His willingness to keep going, despite his flaws, made him relatable. People saw their own struggles mirrored in his story, and his resilience gave them hope. He kept believing that God could use imperfect people, and that belief resonated deeply. Even as he aged, Jimmy's music and preaching didn't lose their vigor. His voice may have weakened, but his conviction remained strong. He wasn't motivated by applause or recognition. He truly believed that every time he spoke about Jesus, someone needed to hear it. Generations grew up listening to him. For some, he was the voice their grandparents cherished. For others, he was the preacher whose words comforted their parents on long drives. For many, he was the one who showed that grace was more than just a concept. He was something personal and real. Now, as Jimmy lay silent in the hospital, his influence echoed louder than ever. Old videos resurfaced, online clips of him singing in his youth, fiery sermons that energized crowds, and moving altar calls. People shared their own stories on social media. Some remembered being saved during his preaching. Others recalled moments when his music brought comfort in their darkest hours. Inside the hospital, Francis remained at his side, gently tracing his hand, reflecting on the decades they had spent together through every triumph and every trial. She knew that his legacy had already outlived him, that his life had spoken volumes. By the week's end, as Jimmy's condition remained critical, the world had heard from doctors, his son, and other ministry leaders. But Francis, who had shared more than 60 years of life with Jimmy, had yet to speak publicly. On Friday, a quiet video appeared online. The setting was simple: Francis in a small hospital chapel, her Bible in her lap, a scarf draped over her shoulders. Her voice was soft but steady, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and unwavering faith. She began by thanking everyone for their prayers and encouragement, explaining that while she and Jimmy had spent their lives sharing the gospel in recent days, they had felt the gospel return to them through the love and kindness of others. She shared that Jimmy was still in a fragile state with no clear prognosis, but she felt a deep peace and the presence of God in the hospital room. She spoke of her long journey with Jimmy, from their youth to the present, recalling his faithfulness and resilience. She urged people not just to pray for healing, but for God's will to be done, whatever that might mean. Jimmy, she said, had always believed that to live was Christ and to die was gain. Whether he recovered or was called home, they would praise God. Francis's voice trembled with emotion, but her faith was unwavering. She closed her brief message by reading one of Jimmy's favorite verses, Romans 8:18, and asking everyone to keep praying for Jimmy, for each other, to love deeply, serve faithfully, and trust completely in God's care. The video ended quietly, but its message lingered in countless hearts and homes. Frances had spoken not just from a hospital, but from the depths of a faith, refined through decades of both joy and hardship. She reminded everyone that this journey wasn't about final chapters, but about eternity. Saturday evening arrived with a special sense of anticipation. The Swaggart family still gathered at Jimmy's. Side had requested a dedicated prayer service at Family Worship Center. Word spread quickly, and by the evening, the sanctuary was full. People traveled from neighboring towns and distant states, Bibles in hand, hearts heavy but hopeful. The atmosphere was reverent and still, as people took their seats, united by purpose. Donnie opened the service with calm words, updating everyone on Jimmy's condition. He was still unconscious, still fragile, still in God's hands. The honesty brought comfort, the shared burden lightened by community. The service moved into gentle worship, simple music and heartfelt singing filling the room. Testimonies followed, a young man describing how Jimmy's sermons had changed his life, a woman recalling how his music brought her solace during a painful divorce, a former addict now serving as a youth leader thanking Jimmy for reaching out to people like him. The altar opened and people came forward, some kneeling, some standing, many weeping. Families embraced, strangers comforted one another, united not just by concern for Jimmy, but by the faith and hope he had inspired. A photograph of Jimmy was placed near the altar, honored but not idolized. People paused to touch it, to say thanks, to pray. Near the end of the service, a note from Frances was read aloud, thanking everyone for their support and love. She reminded them that Jimmy had always said the church was a family, and that night everyone had proven it true. As the final hymn played and the lights dimmed, few wanted to leave. The sacred stillness lingered. The parking lot lights outside shining on a crowd reluctant to break the moment. Inside, a quiet sense of holiness remained. It wasn't just a service. It was a time of surrender, a night when a community, a church, even a nation joined to seek God's comfort and guidance. There was hope and heartbreak, worship and waiting, and above all, the assurance that Jimmy Swaggart was not alone. God was present, and faith endured.